All right, welcome to Campaign Operations, primer for production teams. I'm Josh Hill, AVP of Marketing Automation and Technology at Ring Central. And what I want to share with you today is a lot of the lessons that I've learned over the last few years working with my team and marketers around the world on how to run campaign production as part of marketing operations. So to begin, we want to take a look at all the components of marketing operations. And this is Atomos's 4 pillars marketing operations. And part of that is platform operations and campaign operations and marketing intelligence and development. So each of these has a key component as part of marketing operations and technology. And let's talk about where campaign operations fits. So in many ways, that's the front-facing part of marketing operations, the people who send the email, who send the audiences to different systems and make things happen. But they take in requirements from marketing and marketers and work with the platform operations teams, the architecture team, to ensure that they have the capabilities, the ability to scale, and the ability to pull in data points from around the company or the organization to scale up programs. So it's a very important relationship. And the architecture team or the platform team is going to work with the development team or the engineers, if there is a team for that, to run those database integrations, platform integrations, as well as front-end development, among others. And then you have marketing intelligence or analytics. And these are the data storytellers, the people who are using tools like Tableau or Domo. And they care about funnel transparency. They care about the ability to share with executives and manage the resource allocation. And they're going to provide campaign operations with requirements for how to capture data, what data they need. And all 3 teams will work together to make sure that you're able to do that, you're able to do it at scale, and that data is clean. And if we think about campaign production, it's actually the tip of the spear, the last mile of all of this work everyone's doing. So you have people data, content, marketers, journeys, engineering, platform, and it's all driving toward getting the message out in the marketplace to where your audience is. Campaign production or campaign operations is really that tip of the spear. So let's talk a little bit about the campaign production process. First thing is to have a common nomenclature or naming of various components of the process. And this is just an example here. What is a campaign or a journey? Is it an overall targeted theme and persona over a time frame, or is it actually a program where you're sending out 1 or 2 or more emails across different channels? You have assets and a call to action. My definition is a program is a discrete unit or something we can build in the system, whether that's a complex nurture that lasts hundreds of days, or it's 1 email to send out. Typically as a call to action, it goes to 1 or more channels and it has assets. And this allows you to count things as well as work toward a launch date for that program and measure your success against the SLAs. So just an example of things to think about and making sure that your organization has a common name for things. All right, so who do you need for a successful campaign? You're going to need a campaign manager, a marketer who is responsible for that journey, is responsible for the outcomes of that journey, and can provide a campaign brief as well as a journey design and work with the creative team, the copywriters, and the campaign production team to develop that and get it built. So the creative team, the copywriters are going to bring that brief to life, and they're going to provide that to the campaign production team to insert into the system, build HTML, bring that to life for the audience, create that experience for the audience. Now, the campaign production team is also responsible for working with campaign manager on the journey doc, which I'll talk about in a few moments, and understanding the requirements of specifications for that journey so you can actually build it in the system. Now, you may also have separate channel managers. They're responsible for helping you build the audience across different channels, for optimizing the spend to get that message out across different channels. This role may be the same as the campaign manager in smaller organizations, or you could have many channel managers. It really just depends on your organization. And then you'll have analysts, someone to run dashboards, to provide data and analysis around that particular journey or all of journeys and all channels. So let's take a look about what that looks like in a process, right? all of these people map to a particular set of steps. And as the campaign brief enters the process, you're going to kick that off with creative. And then the marketing automation team and the production team will sit down with the marketer and to get a process chart designed. And you may have to facilitate that conversation and get it on the whiteboard or on Lucidchart. And that's fine. Sometimes marketers have that planned out. Sometimes you need to really map it out with them and get all those requirements and details so that you understand how to build that journey, how to collect that audience and manage it. And then you'll build it. You'll test it. You'll make sure you're capturing the right data, and then you're going to launch it. Now, a good production team is going to monitor initial accounts for at least a few days to make sure that it's working as intended. And the analytics team, the campaign manager, will pick it up from there and understand what their success is, the feedback loop, how to optimize spend or the program, and then work with you on follow-up programs. Now, if you look at the swim lanes and the SLA starts, you get to get an understanding of how things might work in parallel across several days or weeks. Now, the campaign brief is going to kick off this process. You may or may not have a creative session that's separate, a journey session that's separate. You may have a unified session. Whatever works for your organization, usually either or is fine. And you'll note that the creative team is not going to start their SLA until they understand the requirement, the brief. Neither should you in the production team, right? If you don't have all of the requirements, you should not be held to the SLA start date. Typically, that's going to begin once you have those requirements in the journey doc, and then you'll start building out that journey. Now, while you're doing that, the design team and then the coding team is going to work on the various HTML components, the design components, the copy, which may cover multiple channels. And you'll note here that there's some milestones for approvals. It's really critical if they hand off from design to coding that you don't do anything without an approval, because you're going to end up doing a rework. Someone's going to change their mind, and you're going to have to rebuild everything potentially. And that creates a lot of extra confusion and leads to potential risk for production error later on. So always make sure there's approval steps and that everyone who needs to sign off has signed off before you continue to the next step. Similarly, the QA process, don't schedule it until it's fully approved and fully QA'd. And that goes for the production team, the marketing automation team, the channel teams. You have to QA things. And once you do, you can launch it. And that will be your first send date or the launch date of the particular program. And I call it the first send date because you may have a nurture that lasts, 20 or 30 days with 10 emails. It's really that first moment that matters to turn everything on. That's what you're working toward. And then while all this work is going on, you may have an analytics team that's working on budgeting, planning, data requirements, attribution codes, and dashboard building. Let's talk about the journey doc. So this can be a lot more detailed. This is just an example to get you an idea of what's going on. So you may have a process chart and you may have a journey doc. And this is going to provide you with the requirements and specifications to understand how to build a journey in the system. It's going to answer key questions: who, what, when, where, and why. So who are we targeting? How do we know how to find those people in the database? Ideally, the production team should be the experts on how to do that. If there are questions, ask someone. Sometimes the marketer has a good idea who they're trying to target and how to find those people. What kind of content are we sending? In the past, when I've done this presentation for nurtures, it's been focused on email, but now it's omni-channel. So you can add variations, texting, emails, landing pages. It can be a huge combination of things. So ask the marketer, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to get out there? What kind of content calls to action do you have? What are the goals of this journey? Is it fill out a form? Is it to buy something, a free trial? Those are typically good exits. What should happen after that person does what you want? What happens if they don't do what we want? What if they cancel? What if their free trial ends and there's no decision? What's the handoff to the next journey? Is there a next journey? What channels will we be using? And that's going to tell you which systems you need to connect to. That will also tell you if you need to bring in different channel managers. And then what's the cadence? Now the cadence could be, sending something every 3 or 4 days, once a week. It can also be, how often are we running this program? Is this a triggered program where somebody does something and we immediately start doing things? Or is it, once a week on a Thursday, if they have intent data and they visit the website, something happens. Now, a key part here about where the production team can add value is you know all the different scheduled programs that are going out. So you can advise on dates and best practices, but you can also say, hey, um, if we're triggering something based on having intent data that shows up on a Friday at 12 o'clock, but your program is supposed to go out on Thursdays, maybe it's better to change that program date to a Monday or a Tuesday so that data is fresher. So things to think about. Now, when you need to be templating to be successful in production, everything should have a program type. There should be standard um, rules around this. And each program type will have a bill of materials or standard set of things you can get for each marketer. And each program type will also have an SLA and a total level of effort, or if you're an agency, billable hours. It can get very complex. I'll show you a couple examples. The key part to remember is these are standards that you agree on with your stakeholders about what you get in a package. When someone requests, say, a roadshow pre-show, you can have it faster or have more or less work. It doesn't really matter. It depends on what your situation is. But if you can't template this in the system, find another system. So this is what a bill of materials might look like. You might have dependencies marked as well, right? If you don't have copy in creative, you can't do anything, right? And you might include that as part of the bill of materials to show those dependencies. So in this case, what we see that we've got a standard pre-show here is going to have one email of each type. You're going to have certain SLAs for each email and level of effort for each task. Note a couple of things here. This may not be, you're not going to add up the SLA to be, I don't know, 30 days here. It's going to be 5 or 6 days, and each item might have its own SLA, but that's within that total 5 days. The total level of effort is not the same as the SLA, and we'll talk more about that. You also note that any sort of rework, change orders, any additional items like A/B testing, that's going to add to the SLA and the total level of effort. And then it needs to be clear with the stakeholders that if they need something special, that adds to the SLA. Production teams are always going to be challenged to do more with less. That's where templating and process really comes to the fore. You're always going to get asked, why does something happen this way? And the answer is it's built to the requirements, right? Marketers ask for certain things, a certain bill of materials, and you have delivered that. That doesn't mean that it's static forever. That doesn't mean it could change. And we need to apply process analysis tools to that and some questions you can ask yourself. So people are always going to ask you to do more with less. So it's important to document and review your process at least once or twice a year. I find event teams typically want to do that more often because they're trying to be innovative with their experiences. New staff or new teams will challenge you. And the answer typically is, to change the requirements, to reduce choice, reduce exceptions in order to run faster. And it's important also to track your KPIs, which we'll talk a little bit about later. The key ones are really about capacity utilization and are you delivering on time? And you need to show up with that data because a lot of people will hear complaints instead of the 99% you're doing well. So you need to be ready to educate people and make sure that you're aligning to those business needs, right? A lot of business stakeholders will not share with you the changes they have until they suddenly realize they need to make a change. And the process just needs to change with that. So how do you make it simpler? Well, you can use some process tools, fishbone diagrams, ask why 5 times. Ask, why are there exceptions? Why are some teams getting special treatment? Ask, did someone request something 6 years ago that maybe they're not even here anymore? Why are we still doing this? Does anyone actually care about this? The other thing you can do here is, what if? What if we just totally change something? And I'll give you an example. We were getting requests for 100 or more program types a quarter. Not very hard things, but time consuming, right? And it was a one-to-one relationship between the two systems that were involved. And I finally said to the production manager, hey, I think we need to rethink this. Why are we getting so many of these things? And she said, yeah, we've been thinking about it, and it boils down to the attribution code. And I said, oh, I don't think that's how they're supposed to use the attribution code. She said, yeah, that's how they wanted it. So I'm like, well, let's go talk to their manager and ask them, we have a challenge. We don't have enough capacity for this. So we can either get more capacity if you want to continue doing the reporting this way, or we can change how you do the reporting and we can just set it up so it's set it and forget it. And we don't have to ever do this again. And he said, oh, well, yes, I do the thing that's the easiest and simplest. So we did that. And suddenly we have 100 less things to do. And that leads me to QA. So how much QA and testing is necessary? Well, the short answer is as much as you need and no more. Um, what's your brand's risk tolerance? Are people punished for making minor mistakes? You have to decide. At a minimum, though, I would recommend a 4-hour review of every campaign, every email, every other kind of asset. And if there is an issue, that the QA person pushes that back to the original builder and makes them responsible for the fix. Of course, ideally explaining what seems to be the issue. At any time, a builder should be able to stop the process and say, hey, there is something wrong. We're not going to send this out until it's correct. It's far better to be late than wrong. We'll talk about how do you handle something when it does go wrong. Well, mistakes are going to happen. Hopefully, it's not very often. You're going to walk through these several steps. Understand what happened. Make sure the stakeholders are aware. If you can stop the campaign or roll something back, do it. Make sure you document the situation and understand how you're going to resolve it going forward. Work with the stakeholder to rebuild, re-release, resolve, and then update your documentation and if possible, build new guardrails to avoid that in the future. And that's a combination of training typically, but also possibly system training changes. So remember, how you handle a mistake is far more important than the actual mistake. Think about some of the common causes as you build your QA process. Sometimes it's poor documentation and training. Often I find that it's really the process wasn't followed in some fashion, right? Someone changed something and failed to communicate it in the right way. Someone didn't follow the process or get the right approvals. Maybe someone edited something and didn't tell anybody about it. But sometimes it's the vendor. Sometimes it's an upstream change where, the CRM team changed, 100 million records and didn't tell you that for some reason. Now your journey broke. So remember, it's how you handle it and how you go forward. So let's talk about team and staffing. Who do you need on your team and what are they going to do? So this is a larger team and you're going to have a head of production, some line managers and builders. And the head of production is going to be responsible for executive management and expectations, KPI accountability, keeping the trains on time and the platforms on time. And you may or may not have these kinds of teams. It would depend on your business, but I always bring in front-end development for production under this process because if they're with the web team or the creative team, they're never really going to be a part of your production process. And it's going to be hard for them to really understand the templating issues involved. And then you'll have line managers who are responsible for their teams, skill building, training, templating, working with the stakeholders on a more day-to-day basis to get their journey docs and get things done. Builders might also interface with the stakeholders if they're more experienced and understand the journey doc process and how that translates to the system. They're going to cross-train each other and they're going to have an area of responsibility, right? Whether it's events or customer programs or a particular kind of system program. Now, a smaller team, it could be 1 or 2 people where you're doing both platform and production work. It could be something like this where you have a director of marketing technology or ops, and you might have a couple of people on campaigns specifically assigned to that. And you might have a platform team as well. Now, something I have been seeing in the marketplace lately, which we'll talk about, is title confusion, where marketing ops managers, if you read the job description, they're looking for campaign production person. But other people think marketing operations manager is a platform or architecture system administration kind of thing. So just something to be aware of and keep an eye on. Now, there are campaign ops workflow models. Now, any model can work for your business. You may find it's a cultural thing. You may find it's how the business has been set up. You have different brands or BUs across the world. Ultimately, it's what's going to work for you and your stakeholders. I don't find any of these models are inherently faster or change the capacity, um, but they have pros and cons. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So in a hub and spoke model, there are two versions of this. One is a shared service model where you have a central team that runs everything. You might have local production people assigned to those regions or BUs. The other model is more decentralized, where there's a couple of people running a standard process, and they distribute those rules to the local teams, and the local teams, can be more responsive and build programs locally. So that's really good for the local teams. The only challenge is enforcing, say, attribution or data governance rules or privacy rules. Sometimes that becomes a point of tension. The other model is Agile Pod. This could be a really great model for certain situations, especially if you want to be responsive to the marketplace um, in terms of content, managing social media, doing certain kind of A/B testing if you have a high enough volume. And where the campaign production is going to come into place is you're all going to sit next to each other essentially. And a campaign manager is responsible for the journey, and you're going to work closely with the channel managers, the analyst, and the content person or people. And they'll all be experts on this one journey. Now, the campaign builder needs to build a platform essentially for testing and iteration, but that's dependent on the content. Where Agile is really great is it can help you be more responsive to the marketplace, do more real-time marketing, where you may realize there are challenges is you shouldn't be rebuilding the platform of that journey every day or every sprint. Executives will often confuse Agile with speed or capacity changes. Agile doesn't necessarily make you go faster. It just helps you reprioritize more frequently. It also doesn't change capacity. You still have the same number of people and points or things you can do. So, really ask your executives when they bring up Agile, what do they really want? Is it more direct control? Is it change of priority? Is it something else? The next version is embedded, where a production person is part of a team. I typically see this with events where there's a campaign production event specialist, someone who's really good at particular technology, which is events, and they'll work with content. They'll have their own analysts, their own channel teams. Um, this can be really great because events is kind of fast moving. It's got specific kinds of technology and workflows. You'll typically see this in a large scale user conference situation, which makes a lot of sense. The challenge with the embedded model, whichever team is using it, is campaign production team will be very distributed, and you can't reallocate resources to teams that need help when, say, like one team has a lull, right? So during the summer or December, campaign person on events may not have a lot to do, but you won't be able to easily reallocate them to running other kinds of programs. So one challenge. The other challenge actually would be career, right? If the event tech is actually a career, but they may actually want to be in a larger field. So does that limit that person? Now, the central service or process is a version of the hub and spoke or the center of excellence. And this is what I use. And it's really good for large volumes because you can really reallocate resources quickly. There's a clear set of steps that needs to happen. It's really a supply chain of campaigns. The challenge you encounter, though, is each stakeholder will be asking for resources. So how do you manage and prioritize that? And then, do you have enough capacity to manage all of that? So let's talk a little bit about SLAs. This is an agreement between teams that if certain conditions are met, you will deliver something within a specified time frame. And you'll have a defined deliverable, right? A program type, which we talked about, a first send date or a launch date. Now, the roles and responsibilities we talked about earlier, but it's really critical the campaign requester has to deliver campaign requirements on time if they want to hit the SLA. The builder really needs to follow up, ask good questions, obviously deliver, but also explain risk and communicate. And this all has to be within a prioritization framework, which we'll talk about. Now, the timeframes are something you have to agree on with your stakeholder. The SLA should never begin until you have all the requirements. The reality is you might do some of that work in parallel while you're waiting for certain things, but it will depend on the situation. And then you have to have caveats and rules around this, right? So if there's a QA fail, The builder has the right to pull the cord and stop production until that's resolved. It's always better to be late than wrong. I've never had anyone complain about this. They would much rather have it be correct. If a stakeholder doesn't provide approval or answer questions on time, there will be a delay. And you'll see potential delay issues in the capacity question. This is the whiplash effect from supply chain management. And I think we all saw this the last couple of years with toilet paper, among other things. And if consumers or the campaign manager has an increase in demand, that flows through the rest of the system. And as the last mile, essentially, you're going to see that all of your time is compressed. So you have a couple of choices, right? And each team does this too, right? One more campaign pushes everyone over the edge. So if you're going to hit your deadline, your production team has to either work overtime or you have to push off some sort of work. And how you do that is always going to be a challenge. It has to be an agreed on process. So the best way is to have some sort of framework to handle reality, prioritization framework, the culture, and some standard rules. Ideally, you have an ROI calculation for each request. That's a standard that everyone has to agree on. And that you can have a waterfall for non-ROI requests. You're always going to have a legal thing, a must do, and what is that set of steps and how does that push off other work? And everyone should be using the same framework, including executives. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about the level of effort something takes. It's about your capacity and the priority. I always operate a no blame culture, at least on my team. If there is a production error, how do we define that? If it happens, we talked a little bit about how to handle that. But ultimately, it's about being accountable and resolving it and being open about it and learning. And then the stakeholders may be a challenge in some cases, right? Some are really great to work with. They want to follow the process. They're just getting there to get things done. Some people go on vacation and they forget to delegate their work. Sometimes they refuse to use the agreed process. So you have to be clear with people that, if you can't use the process, if you forget to delegate something, your campaign is going to get delayed because there's always going to be some question or some approval step that has to happen before you can launch something. Let's talk about capacity and throughput. So again, level of effort is not the same as the SLA, right? It could take you 2 hours to run an email, but if you have 500 emails that week, which one gets done first? So you have a service level agreement to try to manage that for the first send date. And then you're going to have a throughput calculation and capacity calculation. Now, something to remember and that stakeholders need to remember is, let's say you have 5 people and each person can work on 1 program a day. So you could launch 5 a day. But that's assuming at the beginning of the day, all programs have everything you need to run it. Reality is that's never going to happen. So all that work's going to have to be managed and take into account upstream and downstream processes, other delays and changes. What you can typically control is your capacity. And if we take a look at the first example with an individual, you have about 1,900 hours a year, but your demand is 2,400 hours. So you're down about a quarter of a person for the whole year. So you could hire an agency to fill that gap, or you could draw a line and say, hey, we're not going to do that other 400 hours of work. Now, for your whole team, you might have a total workload capacity of 9,600 hours for the year. But your current demand, as you see it, is 6,400. That means you get an extra 3,000 hours. So, reassign people, take on more work if you can. Manage that. There's a lot of opportunity with those hours. Some people ask a lot about KPIs and production team. To me, there are only 2 that really matter at the end of the day. Are you hitting your number on first send date? Are you meeting your SLAs? And do you have enough capacity? Those are the 2 to track first. Everything else is just nice to monitor. And if you do have capacity issues, should you bring in people in-house? Should they be onshore or offshore? Should they be an agency? The answer is could be all of those. It just depends on your situation. So bringing people in-house, whether it's onshore or not, it's really good for people to learn, and you can get loyalty out of your team. You can watch them grow. You can really teach them how to build these things, and they're going to care. Obviously, it shows up as labor costs. It's a little slower to hire and fire, but you build a team that really cares. Now, with an agency, it's easier to hire and fire the agency, and it's going to show up differently in your budget. It's also great for projects, skills gaps, temporary gaps, managing that capacity gap that we just saw. The challenge is you're going to have to try to make sure that you have a dedicated team. They may or may not always want to do it your way, and it is going to be more expensive than hiring in-house. That could be okay for certain situations. So just something to keep in mind. So what kind of systems are going to help you manage your production process? Well, this could be a whole presentation on its own. Kelly Jo Horton and I talked about how to manage your stack last year. So I'd urge you to take a look at that for some tips. The biggest tip I can give you here is have a process and know what your requirements are before you go purchase a tool. Otherwise, you will get sold something that may or may not matter. For project and process management, any of these tools, Asana, Wrike, Trello, are probably fine. It will depend on your maturity of your organization, and you have enough people to manage that tool. Now, I'll make sure that everyone's using the same platform. If people are jumping platforms, that's going to create errors and break in your process. So everyone has to use the same platform. In terms of design tools or managing that journey and the specifications, Lucidchart, Visio, Google, these are all good. Just make sure you're not sharing attachments. It's not 1999. That creates a lot of opportunity for gaps to appear in your process and for mistakes to get made. Make sure it's a collaborative shared document. And finally, for QA, there are the standards for HTML and email and pages. But there are also some new tools like StackMoxie that allow you to QA the whole workflow and run data through the system and not just rely on people to do it themselves. And finally, career paths. So if you look at the 4 pillars and the roles and skills, this could be its own presentation too, but I'll give you some thoughts here. A lot of people I've worked with over the years have started in campaign production. Whether they work for me or I've known them over the years, most people have started here in some capacity. And as they've earned their stripes, that they've mastered the system, understand how to scale or manage people, they've moved up in marketing operations. Now, you can make a whole career now out of campaign operations. That's perfectly fine if you enjoy that kind of work. I've seen more and more roles that are specifically about campaign operations. And if you have the attention to detail, if you're responsive and service-minded, this is a good role. Always read the job description because people will write this as marketing automation specialist or manager, and that may not be the same as platform operations, which may have a similar sounding title in many smaller organizations. Now, if you really master the system, you understand it, then platform operations, architecture, system administration may be a next step for you if you like that kind of work, right? These people are systems thinkers. They might have some coding or development background. They understand the larger scale of the stack and how to evolve it and how to build a platform for campaign ops to work on. If you're more data oriented, you could move to being an analyst, developing attribution systems, telling a data story. If you're more interested in front-end development or data engineering, move into development, or you could do development and platform operations. I actually have people who've done that, who've moved from production to being system analysts and engineers to integrate our data. So it's very much full of opportunity, as MOPS always is. And if you're looking to break into MOPS, production work is actually a great way to start because you might be a marketer who's kind of good at that system. Maybe you're an engineer looking to change things. It's always in demand. It's a great place to start. So those are some thoughts about managing a career from campaign production. I hope you've learned some things about the production process that will be helpful in your role and in your career going forward. So now I'll take some questions and hopefully provide you some answers and insights that can take you further. Thank you for attending. Hi, folks. Welcome. Saw some really great comments today. Does anyone have any questions? I don't see any specific questions, but some people are asking about getting creative and other people to adapt to SLAs. Impulsive people, Alice. Okay.
you're going to have to manage that. I mean, like, ideally, you can explain it's in their interest to follow a process, and their programs are more likely to be delivered on time, launched on time, be better if we can align on this process, whatever that process is. And, you could just be really strict too and just say, yeah, you're not following the process, I'm not accepting your stuff. But you do need executive support to pull that off usually. How long did it take you to get buy-in on the process? I don't think I ever have full buy-in on the process. We're actually looking at adjusting our process now and what that could look like in the next month, the next couple of years, depending on the team. New staff come in and they're used to doing it another way, and it's an education process. And sometimes the process gets tweaked. So I think, some teams are really great. We have buy-in, we have a line, it's, hammered out. This month I'm going to go over the official SLA docs and, get updates on program types and see if there are any tweaks we need to make with some teams. I think other teams are going to want deeper changes, right? One team wants Agile. And what does that look like? And how does that agreement work? And what kind of resourcing do we need? And how do we change that? I don't know, right? We have to figure that out. Messy is a strong word, I think. It's been an evolution and an iteration, so I wouldn't say that. I think, it started with some teams which are, 5, 6, 7 years ago, which were more inclined to want process, right? Like the original email team, the creative team wanted to be part of that, and then it's kind of just gone from there. But you do have to spend time with their executives, with the campaign managers or the direct people doing the work, and make sure that they understand that process, that if there are friction, like how do you deal with that? Talk it out, ideally. If you have to escalate. But at some point there has to be a process, whatever that is. And if people are not following it, you need to call that out and show them and their manager, hey, you can't get what you want because this is not happening. And we're not asking for the world. We just need these 5 things, ideally, right? What do you do when people want to rush SLAs? Well, the ideal process, which I think I hinted at in the presentation, is why is it important? Which executive's authorizing this to go ahead of other campaigns? Do you guys understand that this is going to push back X, Y, Z? If you've got multiple streams and multiple teams, maybe not everything needs to get pushed back. Maybe it's just a couple of things. A lot of people come on a Friday afternoon and say, I need to get this done. It needs to go at 8 a.m. Monday. And I'm like, okay, well, are you prepared to work over the weekend with my team? Are you going to be 100% available to answer questions? Because if you aren't, and you can't approve things on time, then why are we even rushing this, right? I don't accept the people who mic drop and think that they can just put it in our lap and walk away. You just have to be clear with them. We can, but here are the consequences. Here are the rules for doing that. And that's actually outlined in the document. No rush requests without clear executive approval, and someone is willing and able to be there for you, right? So even things like at-show process or at-show communications, which are extremely rare and discouraged, there's a 10 p.m. cutoff time. If the event manager can't be available to answer questions and do final approvals, we're not going to do it. It just doesn't make sense. If someone's not able to launch the complete COPS process initially, yeah, Natalie, I think, I don't know if you're ever going to be able to roll it out as a magic complete process. That's usually how I think, but that's not always how reality works. Either choose one team that's very keen on working with you, or develop program types and templates, right? Everyone's like, oh, why can't you just roll this out in a template? Why can't we just do it in an hour? It's like, well, we can if we have, infinite people, but we also do have templates. And here's what you get. And if that hasn't been defined yet, that's usually the first step toward establishing some sort of process. Like, program type could be, we get 5 pre-show emails, or a single batch email for XYZ situation, or a generic email blast that has one email and just goes out. That's typically how I got started with the process. Let's see, Amy, can you explain more detail about how you figure out our SLAs? Kind of put my finger in the air. I have a pretty good sense of how long things take, and I've been actually surprised with timesheets have provided us some insight on it's going actually faster than expected. So we can sometimes reduce the level of effort, sometimes change the SLA. Part of it's negotiation, like, if you send us a product feature release, how quickly does that need to go out, right? Is it 2 days after you give us the requirements? Is it 10 days? What's acceptable to you? How does that impact the overall workflow? The other is, how complex is setting something up, right? If it's a batch and blast, but the audience list is very complicated to put together, it could be 5 to 10 days. It could be based on the volume of work. I don't think there's a perfect answer. You just kind of have to feel it out and look at the volume of work you're being asked to do and what's important to the business, right? A nurture, let's say in Marketo, an engagement program, that can take 15 to 20 hours to build properly, even if you have a template, because each entry and exit might be slightly different. There's always going to be situations you need to kind of plan for. So I always say that's 10 days, right? And that's when we get all the other requirements, right? So we have to build it. It has to be tested. It has to be thought through, right? And someone's not typically going to spend, 2 straight days doing it. It might be, 3 or 4 hours at a time because of other workload or questions or other things like that. So I don't think there's a perfect system, but if there are any project managers who've done that, that's where I would ask them. Maybe there's a better system. What are some good questions to ask when interviewing for campaign ops role? So I've seen a lot of these roles lately. It's become more of a discipline. Usually those hiring managers do want SLAs and they do want a process, and you need to explain that. Here's your philosophy, or here's what you've done, created a process. You could ask them, like, is there a process now? What's working? What do people complain about? What do they think the challenges are? You are going to be hit with too many campaign requests. Like, that's what's going to happen, unless it's maybe a very small company. You have to establish and get alignment on what's the prioritization process, right? Is it ROI based? Is it a pipe thing? Is it whoever asked? Is it first come, first serve? And you do have to be disciplined in saying, okay, I've got 10 requests. I can only do 5 this week. Which ones need to get done first? And you can propose stuff if people aren't being clear with you. Project management question. And the templates you've got set up. Had a campaign manager set due dates for the various team members that they need to tag in. Is there something that the campaign members just know, or do you bake this? Yeah, I mean, those standard SLAs are baked in the bill of materials as well as our reg process, so it gets usually auto-created. Now that's the dream, obviously, but if you're still working in spreadsheets, for example, you just have to look at your spec sheet and say, this program type takes this long, and here's what we're going to try. We're going to set the due date, and that first send date can change if you're not getting all the requirements or if other things change upstream from you. But that's the initial target date. Now people can click that in, right? And people could say, or campaign manager could say, here's a complex nurture that I need done in 5 days. So that's going to get flagged by the traffic manager, and they're going to ask, well, why are you asking for that? That's inside the SLA. Now, sometimes people don't realize that. Sometimes people need to have a conversation and say, okay, well, I'll have to accept that it's going to take longer. Sometimes there are other questions, and it might just completely change the program. But you can't just accept that, oh yeah, well, we'll just do it on the due date, because people will just stop respecting the process. Let's see, we are decentralized and moving towards centralization. Well, often good, depending on the situation. I think you need to show how your team is supporting the business, right? And I don't know what your situation is, Amy, but it might be, let's just say you had 5 marketing business units around the world. I would ask for a minimum of 1 dedicated person per business unit, and that's the point of contact for each of those business units. Ideally, they work in that time zone for those business units, but sometimes maybe they can't. And then you build up teams around those depending on the workload requirements, maybe shift resources depending on how each quarter or month is going. Even better solution would be to have multiple people for each of those, and they're all working on some sort of layered shift where you can get production done while other people are sleeping. That obviously is a different model, requires a lot of resources typically. But that's generally what people like to see, is like they got someone they can trust, it's dedicated to them and their needs, or even half time, and that they can call them up and ask questions. Do you have any standardized format, process, or form for learning or growing from experience? So Alice, I think you mean like not a scrum call, but like retrospective or post-mortem kind of situation, I imagine. We do and we don't. Usually each quarter we'll go through the teams and say, what are you planning to do? If there's something new or sounds different than the program types we've done before, we'll discuss it more. If there are challenges, usually I get those pretty quickly. Like we need people more dedicated to our shift, or here's how we would like to work. Can we accommodate that? I'd say for whatever reason, the events teams, we have a weekly call, and probably almost once a quarter, there's some level of process change or program type change. With the other teams, it's less frequent because they have less iteration around the program types. That's just how we work. But my team will come back with, hey, I'm seeing this kind of point of friction, or this needs to be scaled in some way. How do I do that? Or here's my proposal for that. So within the team, we're always talking about those kinds of things. And then we'll take that back to build new bill of materials, new documentation, something new in Marketo, something new in the Riker system to try to automate that or accommodate that kind of a situation. Yeah, I think definitely an incident will always get more discussion around that. And then how quickly could we make a change, both or do retraining or build something into the system that doesn't allow that to happen or flag something. How quickly we get that done kind of depends on the urgency or the other things going on in the priorities. Definitely a pressure call. Yeah, no finger pointing, no blame here. Now people have to be held accountable, but that's a little bit different. That's subtle. Yeah, I mean, those are all good questions, Amy. Like, you just have to decide on the situation, which incident it is, who was accountable for that incident, how was it caused. If something happens upstream from us that breaks data flows, we have interconnects with those other teams. And getting them to follow that process and flag, hey, I'm going to change 10 million records tomorrow night. Is that cool? That's a little challenging. We're not always aware of those changes, but it's part of our job to keep in touch with those teams and make sure we're not blindsided or something like that. Any other thoughts, questions? There's like a tremendous amount in campaign operations that I didn't cover because every situation is going to be different. And we spent hundreds and hundreds of hours over the years developing just our process and kind of coming up with these learnings and principles around it. And we're always looking to evolve. So never assume it's just done. Do you find it best to have all of your team members cross-train on all MOPS platforms? Oh, that's interesting. Or do you find it more effective to have a team of specialized experts? So I think in the presentation I talked a little bit about this. So I've specialized the teams to a degree. Now, those skills are generally transferable, but require some amount of cross-training. Like if you were to, event specialists may not know everything about a customer program. And it's mostly just because of our systems. I wouldn't say that's true of every company or situation. But there are kinds of different people involved. There's different systems involved for each kind of program. So there is some amount of cross-training. Sometimes people do switch teams for various reasons. Or if we need, one team has got time and we need help elsewhere, it's not too hard to do that cross-training. There's a lot of documentation, and we can throw people at a surge in program types. So that's typically how I've handled it. We also have Adobe Experience Cloud and Journey Optimizer now, and those are much different skills than Marketo or standard map. So those would be different skill sets. So that's harder to cross-train on typically. So you may need a team of specialized experts for platforms. You may not always need everybody to specialize in like field events versus, nurture programs. Anything else? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thanks for joining. I hope everyone learned something, and feel free to get in touch on LinkedIn.